Hello, everyone. This is Ed Brenegar, and this is the Eddy Network podcast. And I'm fortunate today to have Jennifer Say with me. She became well known a year ago because of her stand up for her children and the children of San Francisco in regards to how the school system and the community was dealing with schools during the pandemic. And so I want to hear from her today. I want us to hear from her today about what happened in her life and how she managed this and what transpired. And then I want us to talk about what it means for a parent to take care of their child during times of crisis in the world. And so, thank you, Jen, for coming and being with us, and thank you very much.
Thanks
So
for having me.
tell us a little bit about who you are and your story and what has led up to the moment we're talking now.
Sure. Um, I am a former elite athlete. I was a gymnast as a child, had an unusual childhood where obedience was sort of pounded into me. So I think that's an important note as I
That's a
tell this
topic for us,
story.
yeah.
Yeah. I graduated from the sport, and despite my successes, I was an 8-time national team member and a national champion. I felt like a real failure because of the abusiveness in the sport. I'm going to put that aside for now and move to the next piece. Um, and despite all of that, I went to college. I ended up working at Levi's in 1999 as an entry level marketing person. I worked my way all the way up at the ladder. And in 2013, I became the chief marketing officer. Big job, global, 1,000-person team. I was successful in the role, helped the company go from near bankruptcy to a successful initial public offering in 2019. I got all kinds of awards. I was really well liked in the company, um, and was kind of poised for even bigger and better things in the company. In March of 2020, when the lockdowns happened, I was very outspoken from the very start about schools, closed playgrounds, basically restrictions on children, and the harms that would happen to children. I did this under my own name as a mom of four. I did not do it as the Levi's chief marketing officer or the Levi's brand president, which I got promoted to about 6 months into my mouthiness. Mouthiness was, social media, but I also started to write op-eds and lead rallies and go to school board meetings and all sorts of things, trying to affect change and convince the leaders in San Francisco that the schools should open. I built sort of a small, middling following on social media. Eventually, after 2 years of being warned at the company that I needed to stop talking so much about this because it was basically, there was no good reason other than it was not okay. And I think they thought it would cause reputational harm for the company, me in a very public role, saying these things that were considered unacceptable, evil, even racist, murderous of teachers. Um, I was called every name you could think of. And then finally, after 2 years of being warned and me not stopping, I was told there wasn't a job for me at the company anymore. And rather than accept their hush money in the form of severance and a non-disclosure agreement, I quit. I resigned very publicly to talk about, so that I was free to talk about the censorship happening, not just in corporate America, but across America's institutions.
It's fascinating. And so you have lived through something that most of us have not, which is to be a public figure where the pressure to conform is really great. And the conformity is really centered around what the corporation feels like is in its own best interest, and maybe not even in the best interest of its people, but in its own best interest. Is that an accurate way of describing it?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I would say is I think we're all pressured to conform all the time. My pressure to conform and resistance to conform took place in a sort of very public manner. And I think that is different. And that's based on my role. But I think we all face those pressures every day. And unfortunately, I think more and more people are willing to do it, to be part of a tribe or a group that they kind of want to sort of amplify the values. So by being part of that group, it says, I am these things. And with COVID in particular, it was, if you are pro lockdown and pro mask and pro lock the kids at home, you are a good person. right? That conferred some sort of virtuousness. And I was considered a bad person because I went against the Democratic Party. And the sort of, it wasn't just, I mean, everybody thought it for a time,
Yeah.
you know? Um, and the reason I raised the gymnastics thing in the beginning is because for me as a child, obedience and conformity and silence really was instilled in me. And so it's not easy for me to stand up and say, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. And to stand apart from the crowd, it's very difficult for me. Um, but I felt it was too important in this instance. And I felt I was being very rational and logical because I was reading data. It wasn't just a feeling I had. I was like, you know, there were moments where I was like, how is everyone in the world not seeing what I'm seeing? Like, I'm just this like mom. Yeah, I'm a business lady, but I know how to read data. And like, why is the world not seeing it? And it was so astonishing to me. But I felt I had logic on my side. I didn't make much of a dent. The schools did not open for close to 2 years. But I think I am at least making a dent or part of an important conversation now about censorship and the need to have these kinds of conversations.
Well, this is a crisis that's not, it's not short. It's going to be a long-term crisis because
Yes.
I think what we found is that the corporations and government agencies and other groups discovered that they had a level of power over the public that they may not have realized to what degree they did. And so this was an experiment in crowd control, so to speak. And as one of my friends described it, well, I'm just a rule follower. And I said, well, yeah, you are. And so where does your own thought process, where is your own ability to think and think critically come into this? And shrug their shoulders. And
It's
so
weird to me that someone would say that proudly. I'm just a rule follower. Because I think one of the things that's interesting about the sort of pro restriction crowd is they think of themselves as the resistance.
oh yeah, yes. I
And
think
I'm like, what are you resisting? You're doing everything an authoritarian government is telling you to do. There's no resistance here. I didn't quite finish answering your prior question about the company. I think, and I write about this a lot in my book, and this notion of woke capitalism, the company, in my case, Levi's, they sort of do all this virtue signaling about doing the right thing for employees and for mankind and being this sort of social justice warrior. But I think, and they pretend that's sort of the heart and soul of the company. But I think what's important to remember is companies don't have a soul. Companies are companies that are in business to make money. Despite their protestations and all the arm waving about being social justice warriors, they are in it to make money. And so I would just sort of challenge everyone to kind of pause when they see a company doing that, because I will tell you, it is always inauthentic and hiding something else, because it's not only what their true purpose is, it's their fiduciary responsibility to make as much money as possible. So, they saw me as getting in the way of that by challenging these public health edicts. Although in reality, I wasn't getting in the way of it. We were doing really well. So, but I was sort of like threatening to lift the veil on the charade.
And what you're describing is really how these companies are also conformist in the way they operate. So some kind of narrative of social whatever it is gets promoted, and they feel like they have to conform to that because otherwise they look like they're not supporting their customers or something.
Yeah, it's the trend. It's the trend in capitalism, right? To be a values-driven company. The trend used to be like, greed is good and we're here to make as much money as possible. Now the trend is to say, I'm saving the world. What sits underneath of that is a desire to profit or harness Gen Z and millennial activism to actually make money. Like, align yourself publicly with their values, whether you do it or not for real, doesn't matter. Align yourself publicly with their values to capitalize on it. One of the problems, though, is all these companies, and mine was in San Francisco, but all these coastal companies who are doing that, they're misled. They live in such a bubble. These leaders don't know anyone that holds a different view, and they're forgetting there's an entire 50% of the country that does not share this view. And they in their minds have told themselves that anyone that doesn't share their view is some sort of fringe whack job. Never mind, it's 50% of the country. And so I
Yeah.
think ultimately they're really limiting their ability to perform their core responsibility of making money because they're limiting who they're reaching, but they don't realize that.
Well, I think what you have experienced and what we see is exposing a vulnerability within corporate America or the corporate global corporations that we didn't see before, but that there is this isolation that is at the top, which makes it difficult for them not just to not identify with their customers, but to identify with their middle managers, identify
Yeah.
with their workers. I mean, I've
Yeah.
seen that in my consulting work. I describe it as this break between the C-suite and the middle managers and the middle managers, and I have had a number of conversations with the district managers of Starbucks. And I tend to work in Starbucks. I like Starbucks, and I'll work in there, and it's a good environment for me to write. And I can spot the district managers when they come in, and I go over and have a conversation with them. I'm always searching for how that person is experiencing the squeeze between their workers
Yeah.
and headquarters, and they
Yeah.
and that's exactly what they feel. And
Yeah. I think that's right. I think, for instance, um, Levi's, well, they were very annoyed, offended, angry with the stance I was taking. And that did very much align with the sort of vibe in San Francisco. So the corporate employees were largely aligned. And in fact, they were responding to some extent to low level corporate employees being very angry with me. They forgot that they had employees across the country in distribution centers in places like Las Vegas and Kentucky, and they had employees in stores across all 50 states that perhaps didn't align with what the San Francisco
right.
bubble, and not to mention 120 countries around the world. Let's be clear, this is a business and brand that operates, but they're so convinced of their rightness in their San Francisco bubble, where 97% of people are registered Democrats, and they don't get out and understand people. Like, never mind that what was going on in San Francisco was utterly authoritarian, and I don't know why everybody agreed with these policies that were harming low-income people, children, the most vulnerable. But that was the line. Like, you had to be a good person and you had to do this. But there were vast numbers of people across the country and the world that took different stances. But the leadership in San Francisco was convinced that everybody thought what people in San Francisco thought. And therefore, I was a risk to the business.
I remember hearing you make a comment about what San Francisco was like when you first went there and what it became, 20 plus years later. Can you say that?
Yeah, when I first went there, like, I had this weird childhood. As I said, I was a gymnast, I was nerdy, I was tiny, I was like not very socially, I spent 10 hours a day in the gym, right? Like, I was a weird kid. And so when I went to college, I felt weird. I felt like an oddball. And then I moved from college right to San Francisco. And San Francisco was like this place that welcomed weirdos. Anyone that ever felt different in any way, you had hippies and punk rockers and rebels, and like all the weirdos came together to make this really sort of interesting community. And I felt very much part of that because I'd felt like an outsider most of my life.
Mhm.
And I loved that about the
Yeah.
city, and it was the beginning, maybe not the beginning, but early days of the fight for LGBTQ equality. And I was very much a part of that. And I just loved it. And I would say over the course of 30 years, it has become a place of such committed conformity that it just became unrecognizable to me. You cannot hold a view outside of the orthodoxy. And it's funny because they still sort of identify themselves as this like hippie, free thinking place. But the fact is, the city is taken over by very rich, young tech workers, tech bros, as they call them.
Tech
It is
bros.
not the hippie haven it once was. It is the tech bro haven that likes to pretend They're the resistance. It's all so messed up and ridiculous, and everybody thinks the same, and everybody drives the same stupid Tesla, and everybody, wants to send their kid to the same school, and everybody does and thinks the same thing. And I just couldn't bear it anymore.
So in actuality, what we're talking about is not just conformity, but the importance of status in American
Oh,
society. And everything is driven by the status that a person has. And
yeah.
and because you don't, I mean, this is part of what I wanted to talk about, but that sense of identity where you only know yourself by the status that you represent is
Yeah,
really a problem.
it is. I think the weird part is like the status, the piece about like that's always existed, right? Like you go back into the 80s though, when it was sort of okay for people to want to make as much money. That status was expressed through high status brands. The car might have been, I don't know, a Rolls if you were really rich, or a Mercedes if you were a little less rich and you wore Ralph Lauren, and that was an expression of status, or you wore luxury brands. Now it's flipped a little bit, especially in Silicon Valley, where you have like the Mark Zuckerbergs, who are some of the richest people in the world, wearing hoodies and jeans and sneakers every day. So status gets it, but that's a mode of status. And they drive a Tesla, which is I don't even know how much a Tesla costs, in some instances over $100,000, but it's a green choice, right? It's the environmental choice. So status is expressed sort of differently now. You're not supposed, like, conspicuous consumption is out, but that mode of expressing is still a mode of status expression, if you see what I mean. It's interesting, in my world of fashion, brands that were all about conspicuous consumption fell out of favor. Ralph Lauren has had a very difficult time. That was about this Hamptons lifestyle. I have a yacht, I have this, and they're very much trying to change that. The brand suffered because of it, because that sort of obvious status, I am rich, that became sort of outdated.
Right.
But a Tesla is really expensive, but somehow it's wrapped in this like virtue because it's electric.
So, so the way I see that is that products were status oriented. Like when I was in college back in the 70s, to where Levi jeans was a status thing. It was
right.
And so, other people wore other kinds of jeans, but if you were really cool if you wore Levi's 501 jeans, and those, that's what I remember. And then somehow it got changed where the products didn't provide enough of a sense of identity, and so ideas became the real status object. So I think the ideas of that we see as in terms of social justice and other kinds of political ideologies become status because they touch something deeper within us. Whether it's real or not is another story, but I think that's why they've become so important.
I think that makes sense. I think brands have tried to piggyback on that though, and it's why you see a brand like Levi's, maybe the product in and of itself doesn't confer status, but if the product says they're for LGBTQ equality and sells you a t-shirt with a rainbow logo on it,
Right.
That's an idea that you can connect to. But I think people want to pretend that products don't confer status, but I think they still sort of think that they do, right? Like I still think, I don't know. I was told, for instance, I drove a really crappy car. I don't care about cars, never cared about cars. I parked in the executive garage because I was an executive, and I drove a Toyota Corolla with a lot of dents in it. And this is many years ago. And I was actually approached by an executive to say, you really need to get another car.
Yes.
My car. So they still care about it. All those executives, they all drove either Porsches or Teslas or both. And they all sent their kids, here's the other thing, to the most elite exclusive private school, which confers status. It was sort of unthinkable to send your child to public school. I was the only executive that did it. Public school in San Francisco. Some fled for grief pastures in very wealthy suburbs where the public school was acceptable, but certainly not in San Francisco. And so there are still these products or objects, maybe the school your kid goes to, that confer status. And I think when you look at something, for instance, like the college admissions scandal from a few years back,
Right.
that was about the status of where your child went to college. And
Right.
it was sort of unthinkable for these very fancy, very wealthy, very famous people to have their kid go to community college. That didn't support their image of themselves. So they were willing to cheat and lie to get their kid into some other school.
It is a bizarre manifestation of the modern world.
Yeah.
So let's shift that focus to being a mom and how this impacts your children. What do you do when your children go to school and they see the same kind of status pressure placed on them at school by their classmates or maybe even their teachers? And
Yeah.
so how do you as a mom?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, part of the reason, if not like the major reason, I didn't want my kids going to private school in San Francisco was that reason, right? In the early days of my career, I have two older children, 22 and 19. It would have been very difficult for me to afford it. I mean, private school in San Francisco and elementary, it's like $40,000 a year. It's ridiculous. 60 once they get to middle school. But as I progressed in my career, I did not want them to be in that environment. For all of the, equity and inclusion and all the programs these schools pretend to have in their garden and farm and all the bullshit, pardon my my cursing.
That's okay.
It is a high status environment. There's a couple of kids that they let in on scholarship that don't have a lot, but by and large, you are surrounded by kids that are surrounded by excess, that compete based on the brands they wear and the vacations they take. And I did not want my children, even if we had the means to compete in that regard, I did not want them surrounded by that. I thought it was gross. And I wanted them to be in a public school where they were surrounded by diverse members of the community. I often joke, I think I wrote it in my book, my school didn't need a diversity and inclusion program. They were diverse and inclusive because they're public schools that draw on the community. And so, some parents would complain about the public schools because you have kids that are on IEPs or they have, behavioral issues. Good. I want my kids to be around kids that are different from them. That's good.
Yeah.
You cannot isolate yourself and raise your children like veal in a pen to just be sort of I guess the veal aren't protected, they're going to be slaughtered, but you know what I'm saying? Like, I want them to learn to be around people that are different than them. And so that's one of the ways I protected them from that, is that I didn't send them to a school where status is prioritized above everything.
So when the schools went into lockdown, what was the conversation you had with your children about that?
That's a good question. I mean, the hard thing, so I have two older children from my first marriage. So it's a different conversation with very young children versus older.
Right.
And I would say this is probably a failing on my part as a parent, is I didn't really talk so much with the older children. Like, I was so enraged about it. I just was advocating in what I thought was a diplomatic, fact-based way. My older children were not always happy with that sort of public stance I was taking because it set us apart as a family.
Right.
It was embarrassing. It was like, that was very hard for my older children. The younger kids, it's a balance. What we tried to, in appropriate language for younger children, explain that it's okay to stand apart.
So let me pick up on your kids' sense of that this was hard for them because they had not made a choice, but you had made the choice and so they were having to, in a sense, defend you to their friends. And that's oftentimes a difficult thing, where as a parent, we get sidelined because the social environment of our children, has a huge sway over them. And at that point in time when they're older,
especially teen,
they're at that point where they're emerging adults. They're moving out of being a child to being an adult and standing on their own and yet they're still at home, and it's an awkward time for many families.
Yeah, it was tough. And my oldest was actually in college, but came home at the beginning of COVID because the schools closed down. And um, I'll admit this is I don't think I would have done anything different in terms of the advocacy and the sort of stance that I took. I think I could have talked to them more about why. I think they still wouldn't have supported it. It was very uncomfortable for them. I still would have done it. And I still also believe that in the end, I'll be proven right and they'll be proud that I did it and was willing to face the backlash. But I think as a kid, to your point, it's so important to kind of be with your friends and stand out, fit in with your friends. But I think it's still a good model. They would probably disagree with me, but um, I
Well,
think
I
it's
think
a good model.
I think that's a normal thing for
Oh,
kids,
yeah,
late teens, early 20s, to think that their parents really don't know what's going on, and then when they get to their mid 20s or their late 20s, all of a sudden they realize that, hey, mom and dad are actually pretty wise people, and
yeah,
they come back to asking the questions that would have been nice to ask 10 years before, but now they're asking them. And so what about your
yeah.
younger children? What was their
With
response?
I mean, the younger ones, look, my daughter was 3. What did she know?
Yeah.
Um, so I think we had in our minds, my husband and I were both, outspoken. I think that it's good to model the behavior, that it's okay to stand in your beliefs and to um, push back on whatever the narrative is and to stand apart from the crowd if you believe what you are doing is sort of moral and just and right, and you have to kind of be willing to withstand that opprobrium. And I think my younger children, it's interesting, I watch them, especially my youngest, my daughter. She is a rebel sometimes without a cause. She's only 6, but I think it's good practice. Like, she really is fine taking a view that no one holds. She is fine standing out. She is fine speaking up for herself. And it's super annoying sometimes in a 6-year-old, but I try to encourage it because it will gain focus as she gets older. So I think we've modeled that for them. And I think in some sense, it's very much ingrained in who they are at this point. And one of the things that concerns me, having gone through the last couple of years, is like, as a late teen, early 20, I think that's when a lot of people are in their most sort of rebellious phase, and they want to resist and all of these things. And what I saw amongst young people was such conformity. Like, what happened?
Yeah.
If you're not resisting when you're young, I don't know. I'm trying to imagine a world in which when I was 21, if the government told me I had to stay home and in my room for 2 years, that I would have obeyed. Like, there's no way I would have done it.
Right. Right. And I totally agree. And it's one of those things that I think 50 years from now they'll be studying, how did this happen, and what was the cause of it, and what was what are all the stages that led up to this being
Yeah.
the way the public responded to this crisis. And I have my own thoughts, other people have their own thoughts, and it's okay to talk about it. I think it's okay to talk about it. But I think part of it is this notion that you can be silenced for having an opinion that is not acceptable by certain people in prominence. And
Yeah.
I mean, we have talked a little bit about that. So how do we get away from this sense that I am bound by other people's opinion of me, and so I won't be able to say what I really want to say?
Yeah. I mean, I think part of the challenge is you have this, like, what I would call this unholy and quite gross alliance between parties in the past that used to challenge each other. So, the press was completely compliant with government and public health and failed to interrogate the issues. Corporations were compliant. In the past, you might have had a situation where corporations and companies said, we need to open our business. We need to get back to work. We need to support our employees. But you had corporate, government, public health, and the press just in lockstep, which makes it very hard because that makes it seem to regular folks like, well, this must be true. But I question, what happened to the journalists? What happened to the fourth estate? What happened to, sort of
Yeah.
healthy tension in the world? And that's really problematic. And I think to answer the second part of your question, it makes it more important for regular everyday people to stand up and challenge. First of all, why is that happening? Why are you all so aligned? What is that alliance? That is very scary to me. And but it makes it harder and even more important for everyday folks to ask questions. And I don't know how to tell people to get over the fear of that, because what they're afraid of is real.
Yeah,
The,
it is real.
it's very real. Like, I'm not here to tell you, oh, just do it, it'll be fine. It won't be fine. Or it might not be fine. I lost my job. I don't know. I'm the breadwinner in my family. We'll see what happens.
I mean,
But
I lost friendships over this,
oh, me too.
and I lost friendships over things that I didn't really value. Like, I was attacked for not being a Donald Trump hater, and
Right.
and I was told I was insane and I was a danger to America because I didn't hate
Hate him enough.
Donald Trump or see him as the devil incarnate, and I just saw him as a politician, a man. He's a man, and
No, you had to hate him with all your being, with every fiber. You had to. Yeah.
yeah, and it was bewildering to be subject to that kind of vehemence,
Yeah.
and and I felt and I realized after after thinking about that for a period of time that there is a type of mental breakdown that's going on where people can't see what's really clear to them. And so they're either
Yeah.
having to conform or they're either responding in such crazy is the wrong word, but a crazy way that makes it difficult for people to have a conversation like we're having today, where we can talk about our differences, but we can also talk about our similarities, and we can
Yeah.
what is it that we want to have in the future? How can we work together to make our communities stronger,
Yeah.
or better?
It really seems that has disappeared, and I think Trump might have been the beginning of it. It was just this like event that you had to pick a side, and you either saw him as the devil incarnate or you saw him as a savior. And if you saw him as anything in the middle, which is just sort of, from my perspective, I don't know yours, it doesn't matter, but from my perspective, just kind of a crappy leader, and a crude and kind of crappy leader. The night he got elected, I was actually upset about it, but I was like, the good news is he's kind of a buffoon. Like, he's not going to get anything done. Like, that was my perspective. So I didn't see him as sufficiently evil either, necessarily. And I certainly, during the court, I'm afraid my headphones are going to die in a second. We might have to go then without headphones. During the course of my advocacy, one of the things I got in trouble for at work was not being sufficiently outspoken about the Derek Chauvin verdict, meaning like being sufficiently publicly excited about it. Like, I didn't post enough saying, this is the best day ever. And I did post about it. I think the right decision was made. I think that man committed a murder and it was gruesome and horrible, but I wasn't like sufficiently happy. When it came to vaccines, I submitted out of coercion to my, one dose of J&J. I wasn't sufficiently, claiming that these vaccines were miracles. Therefore, I was anti-vax. I did my whatever I was supposed to do to keep my job, but I wasn't sort of just jumping up and down at the miraculous nature of these vaccines. And so then I was anti-vax. It's
Well,
like the whole thing. It's just
this,
so weird.
I see this as a manipulation of public opinion, and it's manipulation to paralyze people's ability to actually think for themselves and act on their own their own initiative, and therefore it's a tactic. It's a like a social tactic to isolate people who are not fully committed or fully submitting to whatever the dominant narrative is. I don't hear you. So
We were talking about compelled speech, I think.
yeah, there's this compelled speech, but I think it represents a vulnerability and a weakness in society that that requires that kind of overarching control of the populace, and therefore, we have to be aware of that, and so what is it that kind of bringing our conversation to a conclusion? What is it that you want to see with how your young children are going to go through the next 10 years of life here in this context? What are you doing to nurture them and protect them and to give them every opportunity to be in a sense like as a mature, thoughtful citizen?
Yeah, I mean, I want them to have a childhood. I just want them to be able to have fun. I didn't have much of a childhood in a sense, so I want them to play and learn through play and have some independence and learn to think for themselves. I think too many parents are these like helicopter parents obsessed with safety, and I think that enabled in part, this excessive safetyism and the expectation of being safe all the time is what kind of made people believe that they could be safe from a respiratory virus if they just did all these right things. I don't want them to feel totally safe all the time. I want them to feel totally loved all the time.
Yeah.
But when I was 5 or 6 and was allowed to ride my bike around the neighborhood by myself, I got scared sometimes, but I found a way to get home. I just think there's too much management of a child's life now. And so I want them to have space to be kids and have fun and learn what they think. And I want to model behavior for them and let them know that it's okay to not always fit in. It's okay to stand apart. It's okay to be different. Do what you think is right. I want to ask them questions so they learn how to think, not what to think. They don't have to agree with me all the time. That's my hope, not just for my younger children, but my older children as well. And I had many of those same thoughts, with my older kids. I think when all this happened for older kids, as you pointed out, it's a difficult time. And, the other thing that's happening at that time when kids are teens is they're individuating and they're separating from their parents. So it's almost like whatever I said, they were going to disagree with. Like, that's just the way it is when your kid is 16,
Yeah.
And that's a good, healthy thing. That's what you want. So in a sense, it kind of played out as it should have and as was expected. So, but yeah, I want them to have fun, healthy childhoods with challenge, and I want them to learn to think for themselves and not be afraid to be different. That's the long and short of it.
So do you see yourself going back into corporate America at some point?
It's a question mark. I don't know. I mean, there's part of me that misses it, not corporate kind of politics, but being in a team and having I'm home alone a lot, talking to folks like you and writing, and that's hard. I like to be on a team and in a group, but I wouldn't do it if I was constrained at all in my ability to speak.
Mm-hmm.
I just wouldn't sacrifice that, but I have to make a living. And so I have to figure it out.
Yes, I understand that.
That pesky need to make a living.
So as we finish, tell us how we can find you if someone wants to respond to you or talk to you or read your book or give us a little indication of how you can be found.
Sure. Well, I hope folks will check the book out. There's 2, as you mentioned, but the recent one is Levi's Unbuttoned, and it's sold where books are sold, Amazon, barnesandnoble.com, or you can buy it right from the publisher, levisunbuttoned.com. Some people don't like giving Amazon their money. It's not a COVID rant, the book. It really is a memoir, and starts kind of at the beginning of my life and why my life as an athlete wasn't the best setup for being an outspoken adult. And then I have a Substack, which is called Say Everything, spelled like my last name, SEY. And I am, despite the fact that Twitter is the reason I have no job anymore, I'm still an active Twitterer, and you can find me there at my own name, Jennifer Say.
Okay, well, very good. Thank you for joining me today, and this has been fun. And I, really hope for the best for your kids. I think you're a great mom because you're attentive to all the dynamics that go on with kids, and not simply you're trying to operate from a single kind of this is what I want. That openness I think is really important for kids because then they incorporate that openness themselves into how they function. So
yeah, I think your primary obligations as a parent are to let your kids know they're loved all the time, and they can always come to you for help, and then to get out of the way and let them find their own joy, and not sort of put yours on. That's those two things, and I think you can be successful as a parent.
Yeah, I totally agree with Will. So thank you very much, and thank you everybody for watching today, and I appreciate you letting us know that you watched it by clicking the subscribe button and like button, and we'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.